haunted road trip. It was a crisp October evening when four friends, Alyssa, Jake, Mia, and Dan, decided to go on a spontaneous road trip. They were college students, always looking for a thrill, and nothing excited them more than the idea of exploring an abandoned place. They had heard of an old, desolate town called Ravens Hollow, just 3 hours outside the city. According to local legends, the town had been deserted for decades after a mysterious plague swept through the area. They laughed it off as nonsense, but it was the perfect excuse for a Halloween weekend adventure. As they loaded up Jake's SUV and hit the road, the sun began to set, painting the sky with hues of orange and red. They joked, played music, and talked about what they might find in Ravens Hollow. Mia was the most excited. She was a fan of ghost stories and had been the one to suggest the destination. Alyssa, however, was more skeptical, not entirely convinced this was a good idea. After 2 hours of driving, they reached the edge of the forest surrounding Ravens Hollow. A narrow, winding road led them deeper into the woods. Fog began to roll in, thick and heavy, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The trees loomed tall, their twisted branches like skeletal hands reaching out toward the car. The atmosphere grew tense, but no one said anything. They didn't want to admit they were nervous. Suddenly, the GPS on Jake's phone stopped working. No signal. They were on their own. "Don't worry, I printed the directions," Jake said, trying to sound confident as he fumbled for the papers. But the tension in the car was palpable. The road seemed endless, and the deeper they went, the more eerie things became. The headlights of the car barely cut through the fog, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. An unsettling silence settled over the forest. No birds, no animals, just the crunching of gravel beneath the tires. Then they saw it, a figure standing on the side of the road. Jake slammed on the brakes. "What the hell is that?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling. It was an old woman, dressed in tattered clothes, her long gray hair matted and wild. She stood perfectly still, staring at them with eyes that gleamed unnaturally in the darkness. The group sat frozen, unsure of what to do. Alyssa's heart pounded in her chest. "She needs help," Dan finally said, breaking the silence. "Are you crazy?" Alyssa hissed. "We don't know who she is." But before anyone could stop him, Dan rolled down his window and called out, "Ma'am, do you need help?" The woman slowly turned her head toward them, her face twisted into a grotesque smile. "You shouldn't be here," she rasped, her voice like nails on a chalkboard. "They're waiting for you." Without another word, she turned and disappeared into the fog. The group sat in stunned silence. "What just happened?" Jake muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. "Drive," Alyssa urged. "Let's get out of here." Jake floored the gas, and the car sped down the road. The fog thickened, swallowing everything around them. The sense of dread grew with every mile, and it felt as if they were driving in circles. Mia kept checking the map, but nothing made sense anymore. As they continued down the twisted road, the fog became denser, and strange things began happening inside the car. The temperature dropped suddenly, and frost started to form on the windows. Alyssa rubbed her arms, shivering, while Jake kept wiping the windshield in vain. The radio, which had been turned off, crackled to life, playing a haunting, static-filled melody none of them recognized. "What's going on?" Mia whispered, staring at the radio as if it had a mind of its own. The volume began to rise on its own, the eerie melody growing louder, and Alyssa reached forward to turn it off. But as soon as she touched the dial, the car lights flickered, and the engine sputtered, causing the vehicle to jerk violently. "Jake, the car!" Alyssa yelled, gripping her seat. "I'm trying," Jake shouted, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. The car slowed down against his will, the engine groaning as if something was draining its power. Panic spread through the group as the vehicle came to a complete stop in the middle of the fog-choked road. Jake frantically tried to restart the engine, but it only let out a series of coughs before falling silent again. "It's dead," he said in disbelief, hitting the steering wheel in frustration. Outside, the fog seemed to thicken even more, swallowing them whole, and the strange melodic hum from the radio persisted, making the atmosphere even more oppressive. "I don't like this," Dan muttered, glancing nervously out the window. Something seriously wrong here. Suddenly, a tapping sound echoed through the fog, faint but unmistakable. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded like it was coming from outside, but no one could tell where exactly. Alyssa's heart raced as she scanned the fog, but all she could see were vague shadows moving in the distance. "Did you guys hear that?" she whispered. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it sounded like it was right next to the car. The fog swirled, and without warning, the old woman they had seen earlier appeared just outside Alyssa's window, her face pressed against the glass. Her eyes, now glowing with an eerie, unnatural light, stared into Alyssa's soul as her lips twisted into that same grotesque smile. Before anyone could scream, the old woman slammed her palm against the window, and the glass cracked, spider webbing out from where her hand touched. "Get away from the car," Jake yelled, but the woman didn't move. Instead, she mouthed something, words none of them could hear, but somehow they all understood. "They're coming." Without thinking, Jake and Dan jumped out of the car to confront her. But as soon as they did, she vanished, dissolving into the fog like a wraith. Jake stood frozen, his breath visible in the frigid air, while Dan scanned the area, looking for any sign of her. "Get back in the car!" Mia screamed, and that's when they saw them, shadowy figures emerging from the fog, moving silently toward them. Story resumes. Here, after what seemed like hours, they finally reached the entrance to Raven's Hollow. The town was a crumbling relic of the past, its once grand buildings now decrepit and overgrown with vines. The streets were empty, not a single light or sign of life anywhere. "This place gives me the creeps," Alyssa whispered as they stepped out of the car. The air was thick, and it smelled of decay. "Let's just explore a little and get out," Jake suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. As they walked through the town, they noticed something strange. Every house had its windows shattered, as if something had broken in rather than out. Old signs creaked in the wind, and the wooden doors hung off their hinges. But the most disturbing thing was the feeling that they were being watched. As they made their way down a narrow alley, they came across a decayed church. The wooden doors were splintered, and the roof looked like it had collapsed long ago. Mia, intrigued by the eerie sight, suggested they explore the inside. Alyssa hesitated but followed them in, her heart racing. Inside, the church was even worse than the outside had suggested. The pews were overturned, and strange symbols were carved into the walls. A large, cracked mirror hung above the altar, reflecting their uneasy expressions. But what caught their attention most was a torn diary lying on the floor. Dan picked it up and began to read aloud. "October 12th. They came for us. We tried to leave, but the road only led us back here. There is no escape. They watch from the shadows." "What does that mean?" Mia asked, her voice shaky. Suddenly the temperature in the room dropped, and the mirror above the altar began to fog up. As they watched in horror, words appeared on the glass. "Leave now." Panic set in, and they scrambled to leave the church. Outside, the fog had thickened even more, obscuring the road they had come from. They ran toward the car, but the sound of footsteps echoed behind them. Not just one set, many. They glanced back and saw them, figures pale and gaunt, emerging from the buildings. Their hollow eyes and twisted smiles were illuminated by the car's headlights, their numbers growing with each passing second. "We're surrounded," Jake yelled as he fumbled for the keys. The figures closed in, their faces expressionless, their movements inhuman. They didn't walk. They seemed to glide, their feet never quite touching the ground. Just as the first of the figures reached the car, Jake managed to start the engine. The car roared to life, and they sped off down the road, the figures chasing them, their twisted forms reflected in the rearview mirror. Alyssa sat in the back seat, her hands shaking as she stared at the dark forest passing by. But even as they left the town behind, something felt wrong. The road seemed too familiar. "Jake, stop," Alyssa whispered, her voice barely audible. "We've been here before." Jake's eyes widened as the realization hit. They weren't escaping Raven's Hollow. The road was looping, pulling them back toward the town. No matter how far they drove, they were trapped. The fog swallowed them whole once again, and the figures reappeared, standing in the distance waiting for them. There was no way out. They were never meant to leave. With the new paragraphs, the sense of inescapable doom deepens as the friends realize they are trapped in a nightmare that they cannot outrun.